supporters, relationship between the president and the oligarchs, and the efforts to re-Sovietize the educational system and other aspects of of society. And I got to thinking that after having spent 10 years inside the Ukrainian government, I've been in Ukraine for 20 years, it's more like a sentence at this point, but 10 years as an advisor and trying to deal with many of these issues, what struck me was that how little has changed in 20 years. A lot has changed. Tout se change, tout c'est pareil. And so I decided today I would talk about, try to put a little bit of context and framework into we've heard a lot about the what is going on in Ukraine. I wanted to talk a little bit about the why. And maybe if we understand the why a little bit better, we can then try to deal with the what. And I will give you a few whats at the end of my presentation of what I think would be effective. I think we need to understand that what we're dealing with today is a crisis of institutional legitimacy. There's a massive disconnect between the government and society. It's never been greater. Indeed, probably the situation in business and in society has never been worse in 20 years of independence. But this is not all new. And in my view, all of the post-Soviet leadership in Ukraine, we started with the nomenclatura, we went to the Red Directors, we then had various shades of Democrats, and now we have criminals. But the problem is, this is a systemic problem, and what we have and what we're witnessing today is sort of the logical extension and the excess, if you like, the most egregious examples of what happens when you have a system of the sort that is taking place in Ukraine. And I don't think it's a failure of political will, because a failure of political will presupposes that somebody's made an attempt. I think this is an abdication of political will in terms of undertaking any very serious beyond the very veneer of reforms in the country. And fundamentally, there's been a failure to implement a system of democratic governance. I'd like to spend just a minute on, I don't want to turn this into a political science lecture, but I think it's important that we define our terms, that we understand what we're talking about when we're talking about democratic governance and the rule of law, because you hear this from all of the aid agencies and the donors, etc., and they're right. But we need to understand what we're talking about. Democratic governance it's that mediation of the relationship between the citizen and the state based on the rule of law. And I don't mean the rule of law in a narrow sense of protection of property rights. I'm talking about a set of overarching organizing principles based on of democracy, based on freedom and justice. And fundamentally, we can talk about these things, but how do you implement them in society? In our democracy, we take this for granted. This is why we're very facile sometimes when we talk about reforms that are needed in Ukraine. But it's the institutions of our country, it's the institutions of state that actually implement those values of the rule of law into society. And these principles are essentially governed by transparency, accountability, and a focus on service delivery. We expect our institutions to have the citizen as the fundamental building block and focus of our democratic system, and we essentially expect that the relationship between the citizen and the state is such that the state should conduct its activities in every way that respects the rights of the citizen according to certain rules and principles of justice. That sounds very theoretical, but we live this every day, and we take it for granted so much now that we oftentimes don't understand the enormous difficulty in failed states or emerging democracies or whatever we have, totalitarian countries, in making that leap. Rule of law limits and legitimizes power. It's the basis on which our governments have the right to take decisions in our name, and the basis on which they are held to account. Now, Ukraine inherited a system of what is called the command administrative system of governance, inherited from Soviet times. It's not ruled of law, it's ruled by laws. You pass a law, therefore it's legitimate. It doesn't matter whether it's just or fair. And the citizen is there to serve the state. There's a focus on the collective, the narod, rather than the individual. And the legal foundation of the rule by laws gave Soviet officials tremendous administrative control over the lives and activities of citizens. And this is the essential aspect of this exercise of power. It's arbitrary. People don't have a say. There are no inputs. and what the bureaucrats say, how they interpret the law, which is all, in many respects, very opaque and unaccountable, it oftentimes ends up promoting special interests. The World Bank, early in the 90s, when they started focusing on these issues, said that there was a great danger of state capture by oligarchs and by powerful interests that can take over the state. And I think that's what we are seeing today to an extreme extent. So as you can see, the challenge in 1991, and for the last 20 years, has been to completely reverse the citizen-state relationship in the command administrative system of governance. This was always going to be a massive undertaking because you have to change the mindset, not just of the government, but of the people. And already 5 minutes, I just got started. We had to change public masters, to change people from being public masters, the government from being public masters into being public servants, and to change the culture of paternalism into one of individualism. And the problem is that the Constitution of Ukraine built this problem and this tension and actually complicated things more than it resolved them. Every constitution is a compromise. But we ended up with a constitution that, even though it had tremendous principles, etc., gave a very powerful presidency with executive authority, and also executive authority to the cabinet of ministers, and was supposed to be somehow balanced by parliament. So we got some place between Havel and Nazarbayev in terms of the role of the president. And we did not undertake the most pressing need, which, because of this institutional power struggle that's built into as a minefield into the Constitution, we didn't deal with the most important things, which were institutional reform, public administration reform, administrative territorial reform, civil service that would build a new system of democratic governance based on these principles of transparency, accountability, and public service. So, therefore, what we've ended up with over successive governments is an institutionalization of a kleptocratic culture of impunity that is among the so-called elites in Ukraine. They treat the state, various elites, all of them, have treated the state as a trough that you feed at while you're there, here for a good time, not a long time. And very little has been done to really undertake. At first it was a problem of capacity. There wasn't administrative capacity in order to make these changes. Trust me, by the time I left the Ukrainian government, people knew what they had to do. And including, this is where I have a serious issue with many of the policies that were pursued or not pursued under the Yushchenko and Tymoshenko governments, is that these fundamental reforms did not take place. Since I'm now going to get the gong, very briefly, the consequences of this has been endemic corruption, awful public administration, lack of competitiveness, increased poverty, and increasing, again, international isolation. We're entering in a state of legal nihilism in Ukraine, where essentially, in terms of the specifics to this particular government, is that you have a debasement of the public service. All the professionals, and there are many, many good, hard-working professionals in the Ukrainian government, are being cleansed, and people who have no idea what they're doing are being brought into positions of power because of patronage. I'm not going to deal with the specifics of the healthcare system, the church, the schools. There's a real problem with as I said, the re-Sovietization of the educational system. We can talk about that in the Q&A, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. What do? How do we try to leverage, as Canadians, the billions of dollars in technical assistance that has been poured into Ukraine in order to enact these reforms? We really need to focus on, and I think Oleh Rybachuk pointed this out very, very starkly, very well this morning, was we need to focus on civil society. Ukraine is at a crossroads, there's no question, and it's a very clear decision. It's either Europe or Eurasia. You either take the road to Warsaw or you take the road to Minsk. And this is the situation today. Right now, I think we're closer, right on the border of Belarus. But Poland's not that far away, and it's not too late to change course. Somebody once said that the surest way to lose your rights is to wait for somebody else to protect them. And that is exactly the challenge. We need to energize. The Ukrainian population is, great Ukrainian, stolen right now from this government. It took Yanukovych 2 years to get to where Yushchenko, it took Yushchenko 4 years to get. Massively unpopular government. There's an enormous amount of unrest that needs to be harnessed, and God bless the democratic forces. I really hope this time you can get your act together. Churchill once said that the measure of a nation is whether everyone's prepared to fight for common values. And all of this turmoil has really impeded the fundamental thing that Ukraine needs, and that's a sense of national identity, a sense of common purpose, a sense of we're all in this together. The idea that we all can survive hundreds of years of oppression is a great survival tactic. It's not exactly great to build a country. You need to have a sense of common purpose. The challenge to the Ukrainian-Canadian community is to continue to be the repository of identity. This was Mr. Phelan pointed out yesterday. This is Canada's soft power in Ukraine. This is an instrument that can be used. We need to continue to work day and night on people-to-people power. The community needs to continue to work with the excellent work that the Canadian government is doing. And I'm not just saying that because we have so many ambassadors and former ambassadors here, but our embassy is top-notch. And working with both the Canadian government working together with the Poles and with the Americans can do a lot in terms of, this is long-term, hard trench slogging. And I respect Oleh tremendously for the fact that he's one of the few very high-placed public officials that actually quit his position instead of being thrown out and decided he was going into the trenches to work in what he understood and what I think we all understand are the most fundamental and most important places to be. We need to target the middle class. This is what's happening in Russia, what's happened in the Arab countries. We're seeing a middle class revolt. We need to tap into that in Ukraine. Middle class revolt, we're not talking about lawyers and doctors. We're talking about people who have got a little bit of income that they've now been able to renovate their apartments, buy a new car, have a television set, go on vacation. At least they were able to do that until 2 years ago. So the other thing for the Canadian government is to continue the youth mobility program. We need to get Ukrainian students abroad. We need to teach people, we need to give them a feeling that they can do this. People in Ukraine, civil society in Ukraine right now, instead of standing up and saying, damn it, we're not going to take it anymore, they're all planning to leave. 800,000 applications to the US Embassy for green card last year. 6 million Ukrainians in Europe working. These are people, this is the resource, this is the future. Edmund Burke said, all that's necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. I think that's all of our challenge. Thank you very much.